I would like to acknowledge the country on which I reside and work, the lands of the Turrbal and Jagera people, and pay my respect to all elders past and present. I acknowledge that these lands were never ceded, and I pay my respects to all Indigenous peoples within and across the Indo-Pacific. The research focus that I am privileged to lead is looking at shocks and violence against women. So what this means is that we're looking at those short-term, intense moments where the institutions that respond to violence against women may be under pressure or may not be able to function adequately due to a disaster or a conflict or extreme climate weather event. And so what we're looking in this research is how do these shocks impact on the protection available to populations, as well as what can be done to prevent these systems from undergoing stress and failure during a shock. What we've been looking at in particular is what is the level of research that exists around trying to understand the relationship between the types of gender-based violence that occurs during shocks. And what we've found to date is that there's a whole large number of disasters and extreme climate weather events that would be defined as climate change, but we're not really getting down into the deeper level to understand what are the types of violence that occur before the shock, during the shock, and after the shock, and how do responses need to change and adapt. We're also trying to understand now as well what functions can protect, what services can protect populations before the onset of the shock. So what really works to improve population safety and reduce the likelihood of them experiencing particular types of gender-based violence that are strongly associated with these shocks. So what we're finding at the moment is that the Indo-Pacific as a region has been really understudied, even though it's a region that's been particularly impacted by a large number of shocks. So there's a real need for us to be able to look into how populations are mobilising their protection, and this requires really close relationships with communities so that we are able to build trust with them, to be able to document the important work that they're doing. One particular area of research that we've been doing where we really think seriously about the 3I approach, interdisciplinary, Indo-Pacific and Indigenous-centred research, is the research that we're looking at the relationship between conflict and sexual violence. And so what has been really important about this research, and I will give the example of our Justice Denied conference, which we ran this year in 2025, was that we really thought about the location of the conference where it was being held, which is in Australia, and that history of frontier wars and the fact that we know that conflict-related sexual violence happened in this country. So we made sure that we had recognition and conversations about this legacy of violence that continues to this day. We also made sure that we had Indigenous representation from across the Pacific as well as from across Asia as well. And so there was conversations around the way in which Indigenous knowledge is really important for thinking about the legacy of conflict-related sexual violence, particularly those who have undergone colonisation. What was also really important about the work that we're doing with conflict-related sexual violence is that we are centering it on the Indo-Pacific. So a lot of the research and a lot of the advocacy around conflict-related sexual violence tends to be located in other regions. Yet the Indo-Pacific has not only a history of intense conflict-related sexual violence, it also has a lot of situations today that would be defined as conflict or war or intergroup violence that is strongly associated with sexual violence. And so for us, it's really important to listen to and give a platform for the advocates who want to talk about the violence that they're responding to and experiencing as sexual violence and it related to the conflict that's happening in their location. What we were really committed to is also approaching conflict-related sexual violence with an interdisciplinary focus. So we had representatives from the sectors who are working in this area, those who are representing legal cases, those who are doing psychosocial services, those who are providing health support, as well as those who are doing more the human rights focus and advocacy. The way in which we want to collaborate with research partners in our work stream is in two ways. So the first way is to be understanding from partners who are responding to shocks, maybe at the policy level, to be appreciating what do they see as the barriers to them thinking about the prevention of this violence in what we call peacetime. So what would be required to activate attention to the conditions that we know can protect populations. So when we think about the Women's Safety Index within CEVAW, we've been able to identify that there's an equity dimension, a protection dimension, and a resource dimension that are really important for being able to have a baseline protection. It doesn't mean that no one's going to experience violence, but it improves the chance that populations may be able to have access to resources, may have better protection laws in place before the onset of that shock. So we're really interested in trying to understand how would this safety index be appreciated on the ground, how could it be improved, and what would it take for communities to take that on and then use it to advocate for policy or legislative change. The second area of research relationships that we're really focusing on is with those who are doing the hard daily work as practitioners and advocates and researchers as well across the region. And coming together and having conversations around where is there already research, where there needs to be more research, and how can we collectively come together to do the data collection in a way that is safe, responsible, ethical, but at the same time as well make sure that what we do at the end of this project is not just a written paper, although important, but is also giving back to community. So, for example, with one of the relationships that we've developed with ActionAid Australia through Shifting the Power Coalition, we're talking a lot about the way in which perhaps training on the ground can be done so that groups who participate in our research then have the chance to be able to go off and do their own research and their own monitoring and evaluation into the future, which is really important for their advocacy and their access to more resources. So one of the areas that we're wanting to really focus on for this coming year is to look at the way in which evidence around conflict-related sexual violence is being collected and the impact that the wave of digitalisation, use of AI is impacting on what counts as evidence, how this is used for advocacy messaging, and how we can make sure that we protect survivors and those who are doing the advocacy work on the ground. So that's an area that we're really excited about, and we know that that's an area where there needs to be a lot more conversations taking place because the United Nations and other groups are starting to admit digital evidence into their investigations and into their monitoring. But we are still operating in an environment where there's lots of people engaging in this space and using really different practices, and survivor-centred approach is key here. So we'd like to be leading and contributing to that conversation. We're going to start engaging in communities who are working really hard to be prepared for extreme climate weather events. And so in particular in Papua New Guinea and Madang, with the Huskrook Initiative, we're going to be doing work with the young women there and looking at the way in which they are preparing for the onset of climate change extreme weather events, and then mobilising in response to when these events happen, and what enables them to collectively organise, provide protection, provide solutions to communities on the ground, and to help prepare them in the event of these events, where to go if they're needing to seek safety and refuge. And a lot of that work is around co-design and collaboration and understanding what works on the ground. We're going to be convening a call for papers and a workshop in the middle of the year looking at what research is being done specifically in the Indo-Pacific around gender-based violence and climate change. What we're really trying to understand here is the work that's being done, the research that's being looked at in terms of the types of violence that is being detected during these events, and are there changes depending on the type of extreme weather event that we're looking at? Is it about some populations are displaced, whereas others get to stay in their home? Is it that we have some services can continue to function during some events and at other times they can't? And trying to document that in a little bit more deeper detail allows us to start to identify not only the relationship between gender-based violence and extreme weather events and climate change, but also from a policy perspective, what sorts of dedication of resources and laws and regulations, what sort of supports are needed for those on the ground to be responding depending on the type of the event that they may be experiencing. So in the area of looking at conflict-related sexual violence in the Indo-Pacific, what we're really wanting to have more conversations about is the conditions in which a lot of those who are collecting the reports, responding to survivors and advocating for change, what do they need? and what can we do that is responsive to their needs, and how can we ensure that the work that they're doing, the supports that they're providing are safe. It's been really striking that the groups who are working really hard in locations that are affected by conflict or situations that aren't technically defined as war or conflict but are still very violent places where tensions can erupt very quickly due to elections and other types of local political situations. That designation of that area or that situation as conflict or as being politically tense mobilises a lot of understanding then that this work is trying to be done responding to sexual violence in very dangerous situations, where those responding to it or trying to document it can themselves then be at risk of harm. And so that tends to increase stigma but also increase silence. And it's really hard to communicate this work and to talk about this work. And so what we're trying to do is create those spaces where they can be conversations amongst those from different regions, from different countries that are doing this work, and to understand from each other how they're doing it, and for us with their support to be documenting it and then to be thinking about how can we present to stakeholders, to funders, to policymakers, what supports are needed to recognise the work that they're doing and to provide safety, as well as to recognise that these situations that are experiencing conflict-related sexual violence are really violent situations for those who are trying to respond. The other area that I think is really important for our program is to be thinking about the way in which the research that we're doing, for example, on climate change and gender-based violence, is progressing the conversation at that local community level in terms of solutions. There's a real desire for not just saying, look, there's a problem here, but what works? You know, there are populations that have been experiencing extreme climate weather events now, sadly, at an increasing rate every year. And so some populations, especially across the Pacific, are way ahead in terms of thinking about how they need to be prepared, how they need to respond, and how they need to mobilise and support each other at that community level. And that lived knowledge and experience from generations before, sharing that information and that knowledge. And so for us, it's about being able to not just talk about the problem, but also talk about and celebrate the solutions that are being found, and to present those solutions to other, locations such as Australia, where we can actually think about a cross-country, cross-community collaboration. And that's what I would love to see more of. A number of my PhD students are doing research across Australia and the Pacific as well as Asia. And the one thing that all of them say is that when they do interviews or when they have conversations in their communities on this area, they want to learn and understand what each other is doing, what have been the shared lessons learned and experiences. So I'd really like to be able to create that community of shared lessons learned across the Indo-Pacific. For me, it's really about the students who come to me and are passionate about a project, and often they're passionate because of it's something that they've lived or they've seen or they've taught or they've had to, respond to. And it's about going on a journey with them, and I learn so much when I'm with my students about how they see the world, how their experiences have shaped what they think counts as knowledge and what should be done in response to what they're witnessing. So for me, it's about going on that journey with them and making sure that that the work that we do is something that they and I are proud of, and we feel like we've contributed to the conversation. What we're trying to do really differently in our work stream is encourage PhD students to have their own project, to feel like though they're contributing to a bigger research question and to learn from each other. So for example, all of our PhD students who are looking at gender-based violence and climate change are asking questions about prevention and protection. And so even though they have their own discrete projects, they're having conversations about, well, what does protection look like at a macro scale? And how does that change from the micro at the individual level or at the meso at the community level? What does it mean for a state to protect its populations from gender-based violence due to climate change? Even though they're all doing different locations and even slightly different research questions, they all feel like they're contributing to this bigger question about gender-based violence and climate change and the different roles that actors and communities can have in trying to prevent this. And I really love that. And I think we can only do that in CEVAW because we've got this special gift where we're able to give all of our PhD students a shared space and a shared sense of belonging to this bigger project. And I see it's really inspiring for them because they feel like they're doing their PhD, but they're doing it as part of a community who speaks the same language and has the same concerns.